The key felt heavier than it should have in Sarah Chen's palm, its brass surface tarnished black with age and neglect. She stood before the wrought iron gates at Blackwood Manor on October 15, 2025, watching how the autumn wind made the rusted metal sign a low, mournful tune that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth beneath her feet. The real estate agent had handed her this key 3 hours ago with trembling fingers, his eyes never quite meeting hers as he stammered through the paperwork. "You sure about this, miss?" He'd asked for the 4th time, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. "I mean, there are other properties, nicer ones, safer ones." But Sarah had already made her decision the moment she'd seen the listing buried deep in the rejected properties folder, priced so low it seemed like a clerical error. $27,000 for a Victorian mansion that had once housed railroad barons. The catch, of course, was written in the fine print that most people never bothered to read. Property carries historical significance and local reputation. Buyer assumes all associated risks and liabilities. Now, as she pushed open the gates that groaned like arthritic joints, Sarah understood why the price had been so absurdly low. The very air around Blackwood Manor felt thick, oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The Gothic mansion loomed before her, its broken windows like hollow eye sockets. Sarah had always been drawn to broken things, a compulsion her ex-husband had called a character flaw. "You can't save everything, Sarah," he'd said during their last fight, his voice sharp with frustration. "Some things are broken for a reason. Some things are meant to stay that way." But as she stood before the manor's massive oak doors, their carved surfaces depicting scenes of harvest and plenty, now weathered into abstract suggestions of their former glory, Sarah felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when she'd found her grandmother's painting collection moldering in the attic, or when she discovered the abandoned Victorian greenhouse behind her childhood home. This wasn't just about buying property. This was about resurrection. The door opened with a sound like splitting bone, and Sarah stepped into the heart of the darkness that had swallowed Blackwood Manor whole. The entrance hall stretched before her like a cathedral of shadows, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into blackness overhead. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that struggled through the grimy windows, creating an ethereal, almost sacred atmosphere. The floorboards beneath her feet were wide plank oak, and despite the neglect, they felt solid, dependable. The bones of this house were good bones. Sarah pulled out her phone and switched on its flashlight, sweeping the beam across walls that had once been painted in rich burgundy and gold. The wallpaper hung in long strips, like skin peeling from a healing wound, and she could see the craftsmanship underneath. Hand-carved wainscoting, elaborate crown molding, baseboards that had been cut and fitted with the kind of precision that no longer existed in modern construction. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. She wasn't sure why she'd spoken. There obviously wasn't anyone here, hadn't been for years, but the silence felt so complete it seemed almost rude not to acknowledge it. The echo that came back to her was wrong somehow, lasting longer than it should have, carrying undertones that hadn't been in her original voice. Sarah shook her head, blaming acoustics and her own overactive imagination. She'd read enough about the manor's history to know why her mind might be playing tricks on her. Blackwood Manor was built in 1897 by Cornelius Blackwood. For 13 years, until 1910, the manor had been the crown jewel of the county, hosting elaborate parties that drew guests from as far away as New York and Chicago. Then, in 1910, everything had changed. Sarah played the flashlight beam across the grand staircase that curved upward into the mansion's upper floors, its marble steps stained with what looked like water damage but could have been anything. The brass banister was green with oxidation, but the metalwork was still beautiful. Grapevines and leaves intertwined in patterns that seemed to shift and move in the dancing light. But when she'd arrived the next morning, the family was gone. Not just absent, gone. Their beds hadn't been slept in. Their clothes remained in their wardrobes. Cornelius's gold watch, which he never traveled without, sat on his nightstand beside a glass of water that had grown a skin of dust overnight. The dinner dishes were still in the sink where the housekeeper had left them to soak. The only sign of disturbance had been in the basement. Sarah found herself drawn toward the back of the house, following a hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track her movement through the gloom. The faces were stern, unsmiling, typical of Victorian photography, but there was something else in those painted gazes, a kind of knowledge, maybe, or warning. The kitchen, when she found it, was a monument to early 20th century domesticity. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface still scattered with pots and pans that looked as though they'd been abandoned mid-meal. Copper molds hung from hooks on the ceiling, green with patina, but still beautiful in their functional simplicity. Sarah ran her fingers along the surface of a marble-topped preparation table, imagining the hands that had kneaded bread here, chopped vegetables, rolled out pastry for the elaborate dinners that had once filled this house with warmth and laughter. It was here, in the kitchen's far corner, that she found the door. It was smaller than the others, painted to match the wainscoting so that it almost disappeared against the wall. No handle, just a simple latch that looked hand-forged. Sarah played her flashlight over the door's surface and noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Scratches in the paint, as though someone had clawed at it from the inside. Or tried to. She lifted the latch and pulled. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from below was complex. Not just the mustiness she'd expected, but something else. Something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in a vase of stagnant water. Sarah hesitated at the top of the stairs, her flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness below. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this was a terrible idea. She was alone, in an abandoned house, about to descend into a basement where, according to local legend, something terrible had happened over a century ago. This was exactly the kind of decision that got people killed in horror movies. But Sarah Chen had never been irrational when it came to mysteries. If you're enjoying this spine-chilling investigation so far, this story takes about 15 minutes to fully experience, perfect for your commute or lunch break. Hit that like button and share with anyone who loves supernatural mysteries. Don't forget to subscribe for more haunting tales like this one. She took the first step down. The stairs were wooden, probably pine, and they creaked under her weight with sounds that seemed to echo forever in the darkness below. The walls on either side were stone, rough-hewn and damp to the touch. As she descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and her breath began to fog in the beam of her flashlight. Halfway down, she stopped. There was something carved into the stone wall beside her right hand. Sarah held the light closer and made out letters, crude and deep, as though they'd been scratched with a fingernail or a piece of metal. Help us. Below that, in different handwriting, they're still here. And below that, in what looked like a child's scrawl, don't go down. Sarah's hand was shaking as she continued her descent, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the stone walls. More messages appeared the deeper she went. Some in English, some in what looked like German or Dutch, a few in languages she didn't recognize at all. They spoke of things trapped in darkness, of voices calling from behind walls, of doors that opened onto rooms that shouldn't exist. But it was the dates that made her blood run cold. The most recent message, carved so deep into the stone that flakes of it had fallen to the steps below, simply read, "We should have listened to the stories." At the center sat a well 4 feet across, covered by an iron grate. Sarah approached it slowly, her footsteps echoing strangely in the vaulted space. As she drew closer, she could see that the iron was inscribed with symbols, not letters exactly, but something more primitive, older. She knelt beside the grate and played her flashlight through the gaps, trying to see what lay below. The light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness in the well's depths, as though the blackness itself was hungry for illumination. But as she adjusted the angle of the beam, something glinted far below. Metal. Lots of it. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized what she was looking at. The well wasn't empty. It was full of things that had been thrown down there over the years. She could make out the shape of what looked like a pocket watch, its bold surface tarnished black, a woman's hairpin, ornate and Victorian, children's toys, a wooden horse, a porcelain doll with eyes that reflected her flashlight beam like stars, and bones. Definitely bones. Sarah scrambled backward from the well, her phone clattering across the stone floor and plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. In the sudden black, she could hear things that hadn't been there moments before, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the sound of footsteps on the stairs above, a child's voice singing a lullaby in a language that predated words. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping on the smooth stone, and when the light finally returned, the basement was exactly as she'd found it. Silent. Empty. But the well's iron grate, which had been closed when she'd arrived, now stood slightly ajar, as though something had pushed it open from below. Sarah Chen ran. She ran up those narrow stone steps faster than she'd ever run in her life, burst through the basement door and through the kitchen and down the hallway lined with those watching portraits. Hold on. If you're as hooked on this terrifying mystery as Sarah is on solving it, take just 2 seconds to smash that like button. This story is worth the 15-minute investment, and sharing it helps others discover these chilling tales. Subscribe now so you never miss our supernatural investigations. She ran through the entrance hall with its cathedral ceiling and out the massive oak doors, not stopping until she was beyond the iron gates and standing on the county road with the October wind whipping her hair across her face. But even as her heart hammered against her ribs and her breath came in sharp, painful gasps, Sarah found herself looking back at the mansion. In the gathering twilight, with shadows pooling in its broken windows and dark stone walls, Blackwood Manor looked less like a house than a sleeping giant, ancient, patient, waiting. She thought about the messages carved into the basement walls, about the dates that stretched back over a century. She thought about the well full of memories and bones, about the iron grate that had somehow opened itself while she watched. Most of all, she thought about the stories the real estate agent tried so hard not to tell her, the warnings written in his nervous gestures and averted eyes. But Sarah Chen had always been drawn to broken things, and tomorrow she will return. Sarah didn't sleep that night of October 15th. The next morning, October 16th, she sat in her cramped motel room staring at her laptop screen as she dove deeper into the history of Blackwood Manor. The coffee she'd bought from the vending machine had gone cold hours ago, but she kept sipping it anyway, the bitter liquid serving as an anchor to reality while her mind spiraled through decades of newspaper clippings, police reports, and county records. The disappearance of the Blackwood family in 1910 was just the beginning. His workers had found him at the bottom of the basement stairs, his neck broken, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The coroner had ruled it an accident, but the workers had quit en masse, claiming they'd heard voices calling from behind the walls, seen shadows moving in rooms that should have been empty. Sarah's fingers trembled as she clicked through the digital archives, each new story adding another layer to her growing dread. A property developer in 1967 who'd planned to tear down the manor and build a shopping center had been found catatonic in the basement, staring at the well with eyes that would never again track movement or recognize faces. The Historical Society in 1983 that had attempted to restore the manor as a museum had disbanded after 3 of their members had committed suicide within a month of starting work, each leaving behind notes that spoke of voices from below and the weight of all those lost souls. The most recent incident had been in 2008. A paranormal investigation team had spent a week in the manor documenting what they called unprecedented levels of spiritual activity. Their final video, uploaded to a now defunct website, showed the team leader standing in the basement beside the well, his voice shaking as he spoke into the camera. "We've made contact with multiple entities. They're trying to tell us something about what happened here, about what's still happening. But every time we get close to understanding, something stops us. It's like the house itself doesn't want its secrets revealed." The video ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with the camera falling to the stone floor and the screen going black. The investigation team had been found 3 days later, wandering the countryside with no memory of their time in the manor. When questioned by police, they could only repeat the same phrase over and over. "The well remembers. The well keeps score." Sarah closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to push back the headache that had been building behind her temples for hours. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that she should pack her bags, drive back to San Francisco, and forget she'd ever heard of Blackwood Manor. She could put the property back on the market, take the loss, and chalk it up to a lesson learned about being too impulsive with real estate investments. But she couldn't stop thinking about those bones at the bottom of the well. In her previous life, the one before her divorce, before she'd lost her job at the museum, before her world had collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane, Sarah had worked with crime scene archaeologists. It was specialized work, requiring both artistic sensitivity and scientific precision, using archaeological techniques to excavate and document evidence from historical crime scenes. She had helped solve cases that had been cold for decades, bringing closure to families who had waited generations for answers. The skills were still there, dormant but intact. The knowledge of how to map a site, how to preserve evidence, how to read the story that bones and artifacts could tell when they were properly excavated and analyzed. If those really were human remains in the well, they deserved better than to sit forgotten in the darkness. Someone's family members, someone's children had been thrown into that pit and left to rot. Sarah's phone buzzed against the nightstand, startling her from her thoughts. A text message from her sister, Jenny, in Portland. "How's the new house? Send pics when you get settled." She stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out how to respond. How could she explain that she'd bought a mansion haunted by over a century of tragedy? How could she describe the basement chamber that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of architecture, or the well filled with bones and memories? Jenny would think she'd finally cracked under the pressure of the divorce, would probably drive down from Portland to stage some kind of intervention. "Still getting settled," Sarah typed back. "We'll send pics soon." It wasn't technically a lie. She wasn't settled at all. Not in the manor, not in her new life, not in her own skin. The woman who'd fled the basement in terror yesterday felt like a stranger, someone weak and easily frightened. The real Sarah Chen didn't run from mysteries. She solved them. Dawn was breaking gray and cold over the mountains when Sarah finally fell asleep in the motel chair, her laptop still open on her lap, the screen displaying a 1911 newspaper headline, "Blackwood Family Vanishes, Police Baffled by Mysterious Disappearance." She dreamed of voices calling from deep underground, of children's laughter echoing through stone chambers, of hands reaching up from the darkness of a well that had no bottom. In the dream, she was standing in the basement again, but this time she wasn't afraid. She was kneeling beside the well with archaeologists' tools, carefully excavating each artifact, each bone, documenting everything with the methodical precision she'd learned in graduate school. "Finally," said a voice behind her, and when she turned, she saw a man in Victorian dress standing in the shadows. His face was kind but deeply sad, and when he smiled, she could see through him to the stone wall beyond. Someone who isn't afraid to listen. Sarah woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping in the motel chair, sunlight streaming through the motel's thin curtains. The dream felt more real than the shabby room around her, more significant than the stack of historical documents on her laptop. She could still hear the ghostly man's voice, still feel the weight of his words settling in her chest like stones. Someone who isn't afraid to listen. By 10 o'clock that morning, Sarah was back at Blackwood Manor. She had stopped at the hardware store first, loading her rental car with supplies: industrial-strength flashlights, extension cords, a portable generator, work gloves, a digital camera, evidence bags, and a collapsible table she could use as a work surface. The elderly clerk had watched her purchases with a growing alarm. "You're not planning on going into that old place alone, are you, miss?" he asked as he rang up the generator. His name tag read Eel, and his weathered face was creased with genuine concern. "That house? Well, it ain't safe. Hasn't been for a long time." "I'm an archaeologist," Sarah had said, which was close enough to the truth. "I know how to handle historical sites safely." Eel had shaken his head, but he'd sold her the equipment anyway, throwing in a first aid kit and a thermos of coffee, just in case. As she'd loaded the last of her purchases into the car, he'd called out from the store's doorway, "You get scared, you get out of there, you hear? That place has taken enough people already." Now, standing once again before the manor's iron gates, Sarah felt the weight of all those warnings pressing down on her shoulders. The morning light made the house look less ominous than it had in yesterday's twilight, but no less imposing. In daylight, she could see details she'd missed before: the intricate stonework around the windows, the gargoyles perched at the corners of the roofline, the way ivy had claimed portions of the walls in patterns that almost looked deliberate. The front door stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it when she'd fled the day before. Sarah paused at the threshold, listening for any sounds from within, but heard only the wind sighing through the empty rooms and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Hello?" she called as she stepped inside, her voice echoing in the vast entrance hall. "I'm back. I'm Sarah. I'm here to listen." She felt foolish saying it, but the dream had left her with the strange conviction that the house was somehow aware of her presence, that whatever lingered in its shadows was capable of understanding her intentions. As she set up her equipment in the kitchen, running extension cords from the portable generator to power her work lights, she found herself speaking aloud to the empty rooms. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," she said, testing the beam of her industrial flashlight. "I'm here to find out what happened, to help, if I can." The basement door stood open, just as she'd left it in her panicked flight. Sarah took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began her descent into the darkness below. This time, she was prepared. This time, she wouldn't run. The messages carved into the walls seemed more numerous in the bright beam of her flashlight, as though new warnings had appeared overnight. She photographed each one methodically, noting their position and apparent age. Some were clearly old. The 1910 date was carved deep and weathered, while others looked recent enough to have been made with modern tools. The circular chamber at the bottom of the stairs was exactly as she remembered, vast and impossible, and somehow sacred in its ancient geometry. Sarah set up her work lights around the perimeter, filling the space with harsh white illumination that pushed the shadows back into the corners where they belonged. The well sat at the center like a dark eye, its iron grate still slightly ajar from yesterday's mysterious opening. Sarah approached it slowly, her camera ready. In the bright light, she could see much more clearly what lay at the bottom of the shaft. The bones were definitely human. She could make out the distinctive shape of ribs, the curve of skulls, the delicate architecture of hands. But they weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged, placed with deliberate care in patterns that spoke of ritual, of ceremony, of something far more complex than simple disposal of bodies. She photographed everything from multiple angles, then used a measuring tape to document the well's dimensions: 8 feet deep, 4 feet across, lined with stones that had been fitted together with mathematical precision. At the bottom, partially hidden beneath the bones and artifacts, she could see what looked like symbols carved into the stone floor, the same primitive markings she'd noticed on the iron grate. She opened her laptop and began typing her observations, falling back into the familiar rhythm of archaeological documentation. Time seemed to move differently in the basement chamber, minutes stretching into hours without her noticing. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't realize she was no longer alone until a voice spoke from the shadows behind her. "You're different from the others." She spun around, her heart hammering, but saw nothing except empty darkness beyond the circle of her work lights. The voice had been male, cultured, with the crisp diction of someone from an earlier era. She waited, hardly daring to breathe, but the silence stretched on until she began to wonder if she'd imagined it. "I'm here to help," she said, feeling ridiculous but somehow compelled to respond. "I want to understand what happened here." They all said that. This time, the voice came from a different direction, and Sarah caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the wall before melting back into the darkness. The developers, the investigators, the dreamers who thought they could restore this place to its former glory, they all claimed they wanted to help. "But you didn't believe them?" asked Sarah, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Belief is a luxury I can no longer afford." The shadow moved again, and for a moment Sarah thought she could make out the shape of a man in Victorian dress, tall and imposing, with eyes that reflected her work lights like mirrors. "Are you Cornelius Blackwood?" "I was, once. Now I am something else. A guardian, perhaps. A prisoner, certainly. The keeper of secrets that should have died with me, but cannot rest while justice remains undone."
"What happened to your family?" Sarah asked softly. "What happened that night in 1910? The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on her from all sides. When Cornelius finally spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion that had festered for over a century. "We discovered something we should not have, something that had been hidden in this house since before we came to own it. The previous owners, the Ashford family, they had built this chamber, dug this well. They had been feeding it for decades before we arrived, adding to its collection, strengthening its hold on this place." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. Feeding it? Feeding what? "The darkness that lives in the deep places," Sarah said. "The hunger that grows stronger with each offering. We tried to stop it, my family and I. We tried to seal the well, to end the cycle of sacrifice and horror that had claimed so many innocent lives. But it was too strong, too deeply rooted in the foundations of this house. It took us instead, added us to its collection, made us part of its eternal feast." Sarah stared into the well's depths, at the carefully arranged bones that told a story of centuries of murder and ritual sacrifice. "How many?" she whispered. "I have lost count," Cornelius replied. "Servants who asked too many questions, travelers who sought shelter for the night, children from the surrounding farms who wandered too close to these cursed grounds. The Ashfords were careful, selective. They made sure their victims wouldn't be missed, wouldn't be searched for too vigorously. But the thing in the deep places grew hungry, demanded more frequent offerings, and eventually it consumed them too," Sarah finished. "As it consumed us, as it has consumed everyone who has tried to interfere with its feeding. You are the first to approach with the tools and knowledge to understand what you're seeing, the first who might have a chance to break the cycle." Sarah looked around the circular chamber, at the impossible architecture that seemed to exist outside normal space, at the well that served as a mouth for some ancient and terrible hunger. She thought of all the people who had tried before her, all the broken minds and lost lives that had been added to the manor's grim tally. She should be terrified. She should be running for her life. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. "Tell me what I need to do," she said. The first sign that something had changed came 3 days later when Sarah awoke in her motel room to find her laptop displaying a web page she hadn't opened. The screen glowed in the pre-dawn darkness, showing a genealogy site with a family tree that traced the Ashford lineage back to 1847. At the very bottom of the tree, highlighted in red, was a name that made her blood turn to ice. Margaret Ashford Chen. Her great-great-grandmother. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through the documentation, cross-referencing dates and locations with growing horror. Margaret Ashford had married into the Chen family in 1889, 3 years after fleeing the East Coast under circumstances that the records described only as a family scandal of considerable magnitude. She had settled in California, changed her name, and never spoken of her past, a past that included 18 years living in what would later become Blackwood Manor. "No," Sarah whispered to the empty room, but the evidence was undeniable. Birth records, marriage certificates, immigration documents, all painting a picture of a young woman desperate to escape something so terrible she was willing to abandon her entire identity rather than face it. Sarah's phone rang, jarring her from her spiraling thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown local number, and when she answered, she heard only breathing for several long seconds before a voice spoke, a woman's voice, cultured and refined, with the precise diction of someone from the Victorian era. "You should have listened to the warnings, child. Some bloodlines carry more than just genetic memory. Some carry obligations." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried calling the number back, but got only a recording saying the line had been disconnected. No such number existed in the local exchange. She was at the manor within an hour, her archaeological equipment loaded into the rental car along with everything she'd been able to find about the Ashford family history. The October morning was gray and cold, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the mansion's Gothic spires like a heavy blanket. As she approached the front door, Sarah noticed something that made her stop short. Footprints in the morning frost on the front steps, leading from the door, down the steps and across the overgrown garden, before disappearing at the edge of the woods. The prints were fresh, made sometime before midnight judging from the frost patterns, but there were no children for miles around Blackwood Manor. The nearest neighbors lived 15 miles away, and the local records showed no families with young children in the area.
Sarah followed the trail as far as she could, photographing each print before the rising sun could melt the evidence. The footprints were bare feet, small and delicate, with a distinctive arch pattern that suggested a child around 5 or 6 years old. At the forest's edge, where the trail vanished, she found something that made her breath catch. A small pile of autumn leaves arranged in a perfect circle, with a child's drawing in the center. The drawing was done in what looked like charcoal on a piece of paper that felt old, almost ancient. It showed the manor in crude but unmistakable detail, with stick figures standing around the building. One figure was larger than the others, wearing what appeared to be a dress and standing apart from the group with arms outstretched. Below the drawing, in a child's careful script, were the words, "Mama says the hungry lady is coming home." Sarah's hands were shaking as she carefully bagged the drawing and headed back to the manor. The front door stood wide open, though she was certain it had been closed when she'd first spotted the footprints. The entrance hall beyond was darker than usual, as though the morning light was being absorbed by the shadows that pooled in the corners and clung to the walls like living things. "Cornelius!" she called as she made her way to the kitchen and the basement door. "I need to talk to you. I found something." Her voice echoed strangely in the vast space, coming back changed in ways that made her skin crawl. There was no answer, but she could feel something watching her from the darkness above, tracking her movements as she descended the stone steps into the basement chamber. The well's iron grate stood completely open now, folded back on hinges that should have been rusted solid after decades of neglect. Sarah played her flashlight into the depths and gasped. The carefully arranged bones she documented 3 days ago had been disturbed, shifted into new patterns that formed symbols she didn't recognize. And rising from the center of the arrangement was something that definitely hadn't been there before: a wooden ladder, its rungs old but solid, leading down into darkness that her flashlight couldn't penetrate. "You found it." Cornelius's voice came from directly behind her, so close she could feel breath that carried the chill of the grave against her neck. This time when she turned, she could see him clearly. A tall man in his 40s, with dark hair and eyes that held the weight of a century's worth of sorrow. He was translucent, but substantial, more real than the shadows around him. "You found it, the connection, the reason you were drawn here, while you alone have been able to resist the manor's influence long enough to learn its secrets." "Margaret Ashford was my ancestor," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She lived here before your family bought the house." Cornelius nodded gravely. Margaret was 17 when she fled this place, pregnant with a child she claimed was her husband's, though she had never married. The Ashford family had served the thing in the depths for 3 generations, feeding it travelers and vagrants, anyone who wouldn't be missed. But Margaret was chosen for something more significant. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "What do you mean, chosen?" "The entity that lives in the deep places is ancient, older than human civilization. It feeds on death, on suffering, on the spiritual energy released when a soul is violently separated from its body. But every few generations, it requires something more substantial, a direct conduit, a bloodline that can serve as its anchor in the physical world." The child's drawing seemed to burn against Sarah's fingers through the evidence bag. "The hungry lady," she whispered. Margaret was supposed to be that anchor, but she escaped before the ritual could be completed. The entity was displeased. It destroyed the Ashford family in a single night, dragging them screaming into the depths of the well. But it couldn't follow Margaret. The ritual was incomplete, the bond severed. It has been waiting ever since for her bloodline to return. Sarah stared into the well, at the ladder that led down into impossible darkness. "It's been calling me here. All my life, I've been drawn to broken things, to mysteries that need solving. It wasn't coincidence or character trait. It was compulsion." "The blood remembers what the mind forgets," Cornelius said sadly. "Your great-great-grandmother's terror, her desperate flight from this place, her determination to hide her past, all of it has been passed down through the generations, creating an unbreakable link between your family and this cursed ground." As if summoned by their conversation, the temperature in the chamber began to drop rapidly. She could see her breath fogging in the beam of her flashlight, and the shadows around the perimeter of the room began to move with purposeful intent. From somewhere far below, carried up through the well like an echo from the depths of the earth itself, came the sound of voices. They were singing. The melody was ancient, wordless, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. Sarah found herself taking a step toward the well, then another, drawn by music that promised peace, rest, an end to all the pain and confusion that had defined her recent life. The divorce, the job loss, the endless nights of wondering where she'd gone wrong, all of it could be forgotten, washed away in the eternal darkness that waited below. "Sarah, no!" Cornelius's voice cut through the hypnotic melody like a blade. That's how it begins, the calling, the song that draws the chosen ones down into its embrace.
Sarah jerked back from the well's edge, gasping as though she'd been underwater. The singing continued, but now she could hear other sounds beneath it. Screaming, weeping, the rattling of chains. The beautiful melody wasn't hiding the suffering. It was made of it, woven from centuries of agony and despair. "How do I stop it?" she asked, backing away from the well until she felt the chamber wall against her shoulders. "How do I break the cycle?" Before Cornelius could answer, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Then, from the depths of the well came a new voice. This one was female, young, with the frightened cadence of a child lost in the dark. "Sarah? Sarah, is that you? Mama said you would come. Mama said you would help us go home." Sarah's blood turned to ice. The voice was impossibly familiar, identical to the one she remembered from her own childhood recordings, the voice of her sister Jenny at age 5. But Jenny was alive and well in Portland, sending cheerful text messages about her job and her boyfriend and her plans for Thanksgiving dinner. "Don't listen to it," Cornelius warned, but his voice seemed distant now, muffled by the strange acoustics of the chamber. "It mimics the voices of those you love, uses your own memories against you. It's trying to draw you down." But the voice from the well was so achingly familiar, so perfectly Jenny, that Sarah found herself creeping back toward the edge despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. "Jenny, how are you down there? I don't understand." "I'm scared, Sarah. It's so dark down here, and there are so many others. They keep singing, but I don't know the words. Please, Sarah, please come help me. You always protected me when we were little. Please don't leave me alone in the dark." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, her heart breaking at the terror in that achingly familiar voice. She knew it wasn't real, couldn't be real, but the emotional response was automatic and overwhelming. This is how it worked, she realized, not through fear alone, but through love perverted into something monstrous. She was reaching for the ladder when the real Jenny's voice cut through the chamber like a thunderclap. "Sarah Elizabeth Chen, you step away from that thing right now!" Sarah spun around to see her sister standing at the bottom of the stone steps, very much alive and angry, holding a baseball bat in both hands like she intended to use it. Jenny was exactly as Sarah remembered her, short and fierce, with her mother's stubborn chin and her father's determined eyes. But there was something different about her now, something that spoke of knowledge hard-won and secrets reluctantly kept. "Jenny, what are you doing here?" "Stopping you from doing something incredibly stupid, apparently. Though I have to admit you made it further than I expected before the compulsion kicked in." The voice from the well rose in pitch, no longer pretending to be Jenny, but revealing its true nature, something ancient and hungry and absolutely furious at being denied its prize. "We cannot interfere! The bloodline is ours! The debt must be paid!" Jenny snorted with derision. "Yeah, well, take a number and get in line. The Chen family doesn't owe you anything, and we sure as hell don't pay debts incurred by people who died before we were born." She turned to Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "Did you really think you were the only one who felt the pull? Did you think the family stories about great-great-grandmother Margaret were just random genealogy trivia?" Sarah stared at her sister in shock. "You knew? You knew about all of this?" "Our whole family knows, Sarah. Everyone, except you, because you were the one it was calling strongest. Mom and Dad decided when you were born that they'd try to keep you away from the family history, hope that ignorance would protect you. But blood calls to blood, and the older you got, the stronger the compulsion becomes." The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture that made Sarah's head spin. My obsession with restoration, with fixing broken things? Classic symptoms of bloodline compulsion. You weren't drawn to those projects because of some noble desire to preserve history. You were being trained, conditioned to be drawn to this place specifically.
The entity has been pulling your strings your entire life, guiding you toward the moment when you'd finally come home to fulfill Margaret's incomplete bargain. From somewhere in the shadows around them, Cornelius spoke again, his voice filled with wonder. Your family has been fighting this for generations. That's why I was able to resist the entity's control, why I retained enough of myself to serve as a warning. Your great-great-grandmother's escape broke more than just her own chains. It weakened the thing's hold on this place.
Jenny nodded grimly. Every generation, one of us has to make the choice. Come to the manor and face the compulsion directly, or spend our lives running from something that will never stop calling. Most of us choose to run, but every 20 or 30 years, someone gets tired of looking over their shoulder and decides to end it once and for all. What happened to them? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. They feed the well, Jenny said simply. They come here, they go down into the depths, and they become part of the thing's collection. And for a generation or two, the rest of us get some peace, until it gets hungry again and starts calling the next chosen one. The singing from the well began again, but this time Sarah could hear it for what it really was, not a lullaby, but a feeding song, a celebration of appetite and consumption that had echoed through these chambers for centuries. The voices weren't calling for help, they were calling for company, more souls to join their eternal chorus of the damned. But there's another way, Cornelius said, his translucent form becoming more solid as he stepped forward. My family discovered it the night we died, a way to break the cycle permanently, to sever the connection between the entity and the physical world. But it requires someone of the bloodline to make the sacrifice willingly, and it requires— He hesitated, his expression pained. It requires destroying the anchor that keeps the entity tethered to this place. The well, Sarah said. Not just the well, the entire chamber, the house above, everything that has been tainted by centuries of feeding. It all has to burn. Jenny's face went pale. Burn? With you inside it? The entity won't simply retreat if its physical anchor is destroyed. It will try to take as many souls with it as possible, dragging them down into whatever deeper hell it calls home. Someone of the bloodline has to stay, has to serve as a focus for its rage while the destruction is completed. Otherwise, it will simply attach itself to another member of your family and begin the cycle anew. Sarah looked around the impossible chamber, at the well that served as a mouth for an ancient hunger, at the walls carved with the desperate messages of those who had tried and failed to escape this place. She thought about her ancestors who had carried the weight of this knowledge for generations, who had lived their entire lives in the shadow of a compulsion they couldn't fully escape. She thought about her nieces and nephews, the next generation who would inherit this burden if she failed to end it here and now. There's got to be another way, Jenny said desperately. Some way to seal it without me dying, Sarah finished. There might be, but there might not be. And how many more people die while we're trying to find a perfect solution? How many more families get torn apart? The entity in the well seemed to sense the shift in her resolve, because the singing stopped abruptly and was replaced by a sound like the screaming of metal under stress. The temperature in the chamber plummeted even further, and frost began forming on the stone walls. The shadows around the perimeter of the room began to coalesce into shapes, dozens of figures in various states of decay, all reaching toward Sarah with grasping fingers. The bloodline will serve, they spoke in unison, their voices creating a harmony of despair that made Sarah's teeth ache. The debt will be paid. The feeding will continue. Sarah looked at her sister, at the terror and love warring in Jenny's face, and made her choice. Get out, she said quietly. Go back to Portland. Live your life. Have kids. Grow old. Die peacefully in your sleep surrounded by people who love you. Let me end this.
"Sarah, no! Go!" Sarah roared, and her voice carried such authority that even the shambling figures in the shadows paused in their advance. "This is my choice to make, and I'm making it. I won't let another generation of our family live in fear." Jenny's face crumpled, but she nodded and turned toward the stairs. At the bottom step, she looked back one final time. "I love you, Sarah, and I'm proud of you." Then she was gone, running up the stone steps as the shadows surged forward and the thing in the well began to laugh with the sound of breaking glass and dying children. Sarah was alone with the hunger that had been waiting for her all her life. But she wasn't helpless. She had archaeological training, scientific knowledge, and most importantly, she had portable gasoline and enough explosives to bring down the entire basement level of the house. She'd bought them 3 days ago, along with the other supplies, following an instinct she hadn't fully understood at the time. Now she understood perfectly. The entity's laughter cut off abruptly as Sarah began pulling plastic jugs of gasoline from her equipment bags, pouring the accelerant in careful patterns around the chamber's perimeter. The shadows tried to interfere, grasping at her with fingers that passed through her flesh but left trails of frost in their wake. But she pressed on methodically, professionally, like the scientist she had trained to be.
"You cannot destroy what has existed since before your species learned to fear the dark," the entity snarled, its voice now coming from the mouths of every shadow in the chamber simultaneously. "I am eternal. I am inevitable. I am—" "Really fucking annoying," Sarah finished, pulling the pin from her first incendiary device. "You know what your problem is? You've been feeding on fear for so long, you've forgotten that some people are more stubborn than they are scared." She looked up at Cornelius, who was watching her with an expression of profound admiration. "When I light this, what happens to you?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but for the first time in over a century, I'm curious to find out." Sarah smiled, feeling strangely at peace despite the chaos erupting around her as the entity realized what she intended to do. "Then let's find out together." She threw the incendiary device into the well and dove for cover as the world exploded into light and sound and fury that had been building for more than 100 years. The explosion should have killed her. Sarah woke in absolute darkness, her ears ringing, and her mouth filled with the taste of smoke and ancient dust. Every part of her body ached as though she'd been thrown down a flight of stairs, but she was alive, breathing, and somehow still conscious. The chamber around her was silent in a way that felt different from before, not the oppressive quiet of something holding its breath, but the peaceful stillness of a storm finally passing. She fumbled for her flashlight and found it miraculously intact beside her on the stone floor. When she clicked it on, the beam revealed a scene of absolute devastation. The circular chamber had partially collapsed, with chunks of stone and twisted metal scattered across the floor. The well's iron grate had been blown completely apart, its pieces embedded in the walls like shrapnel. But it was what lay in the well itself that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The bones were gone. Not destroyed, not scattered, simply absent, as though they had never existed at all. The carefully arranged remains that had told the story of centuries of murder and sacrifice had vanished completely, leaving behind only clean stone and a darkness that no longer felt hungry or watchful. The latter, that had descended into impossible depths, was nowhere to be seen. "Fascinating." Cornelius's voice came from directly behind her, but when Sarah turned, she gasped. He was no longer translucent, no longer flickering between visibility and shadow. He stood before her as solid and real as any living person, though his Victorian clothing was singed and torn from the blast. "I appeared to be corporeal again. How extraordinarily unexpected." Sarah struggled to her feet, testing her limbs for serious damage and finding only bruises and minor cuts. "You're alive?" "That remains to be determined," Cornelius said, examining his hands with scientific curiosity.
I can feel the stone beneath my feet, taste the smoke in the air, sense the warmth of your flashlight's beam on my face. But whether this constitutes life or simply a more convincing form of death, he shrugged with elegant acceptance. Perhaps the distinction is less important than I once believed. Sarah played her flashlight around the chamber, taking inventory of the destruction. The explosion had been far more controlled than she'd expected, contained somehow within the circular space without bringing down the entire basement level. The walls still stood, though they were cracked and scorched, and the symbols carved into the stone had been obliterated, as though they had been burned away by intense heat. The entity, is it gone? The voice that answered was not Cornelius's, but it was familiar nonetheless. Sarah turned to see a woman emerge from the shadows near the collapsed entrance, a woman in her 30s with Sarah's own dark hair and determined jawline, wearing a dress that belonged to the 1880s. I have been trapped here just as surely as Cornelius, bound to this place by guilt and unfinished business. But now, she held up her hands, solid and warm in the flashlight's beam, and laughed with pure joy. Now I am free to rest at last. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at her ancestor, the woman who had carried this burden for over a century, who had fled in terror to protect not just herself, but generations of descendants she would never meet. You've been here this whole time? Watching? Waiting?
Watching and planning, Margaret corrected. The entity was ancient and cunning, but it made one critical error in its long existence. It underestimated the power of love to transcend death, to bind families across time and space in ways that even supernatural hunger cannot break. She gestured around the ruined chamber, at the symbols that had been burned from the walls and the well that no longer served as a mouth for ancient evil. Every person it consumed, every soul it added to its collection, remained connected to the living world through the bonds of family and memory. The more it fed, the stronger those connections became until finally... Until there were enough of us to fight back, Cornelius finished, understanding dawning in his voice. The explosion didn't just destroy the physical anchor. It channeled the combined will of every soul that had been trapped here, focused their desire for justice and freedom into a single moment of absolute rebellion. Sarah sank down onto a chunk of fallen masonry, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. But why me? Why was I the one who had to come here, who had to light the fuse? Margaret knelt beside her with the gentle grace of someone who had spent decades comforting frightened children in their final moments. Because you were the only one strong enough to make the choice willingly. The entity's power came from fear, from desperation, from the unwilling sacrifice of those who had no other options. But you came here knowing the danger, understanding the cost, and chose to act anyway. That willingness, that conscious decision to sacrifice yourself for others, that was something it had never encountered before. And it was something it couldn't consume, Cornelius added. Love given freely, sacrifice made willingly, justice chosen over safety. These are forces that exist outside its understanding of how the world works. They were toxic to its very nature. Sarah looked around the chamber again, beginning to understand the full scope of what she was seeing. The bones didn't just disappear, they were freed. All those people, all those souls that had been trapped here for centuries, they're finally at rest. Some of them, Margaret said softly. Others had family waiting for them on the other side, relatives who had been searching for them across the veil of death. The explosion didn't just destroy the entity, it opened a doorway, allowed the dead to find their way home at last. As if summoned by her words, Sarah began to see them. Translucent figures moving through the ruined chamber, dozens of them, all heading toward what looked like a shaft of golden light that had appeared where the well once gaped.
Men and women in clothing from different eras, children clutching toys that had been lost for decades, families reuniting after lifetimes of separation. She watched in wonder as they passed, a young couple from the 1920s walking hand in hand toward the light, a little girl in a Victorian dress skipping alongside what could only be her older brother, an elderly man in work clothes embracing a woman whose face was radiant with joy. They nodded at Sarah as they passed, their expressions filled with gratitude and peace. "They're going home," Sarah whispered. "As are we, eventually," Margaret said, rising gracefully to her feet. "But not yet. There are still things that need to be finished, questions that deserve answers. The physical destruction of the entity was only the beginning." She led Sarah and Cornelius toward the chamber's entrance, where the stone steps had been partially collapsed by the blast but were still passable. As they climbed toward the basement level of the house above, Margaret began to speak in the measured tones of someone recounting a story they had carried for far too long. The Ashford family came to America in 1847, fleeing what they claimed were religious persecutions in England, but the truth was far darker. They were cultists, worshippers of something that predated Christianity by millennia. They had served the entity in the old country for generations, feeding it criminals and outcasts, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't be investigated too closely. They emerged into the manor's kitchen, which had been remarkably untouched by the destruction below. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, making the dust motes dance like tiny spirits celebrating their freedom. Margaret moved to the massive preparation table and began tracing patterns in the accumulated dust, creating symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the golden light. When they arrived in America, they saw an opportunity to expand their feeding operation. The frontier was dangerous, filled with travelers and settlers who often disappeared without explanation. Who would question a few more vanished souls in a land where death was commonplace? They built the chamber specifically to house the entity. This entire house was designed as a feeding ground, a lure to draw victims into its web. Cornelius said, understanding the implications. Margaret nodded grimly. The entity fed them power in return, wealth, influence, protection from those who might question their business practices. The Ashford family became pillars of the community, while secretly orchestrating a harvest of human souls that lasted for over 40 years. Sarah felt sick as she imagined the scope of the horror that had been perpetrated in this place. How many people died? Hundreds, she said simply. Perhaps thousands. The entity's hunger grew with each feeding, demanding more frequent sacrifices, larger offerings. By the 1880s, the Ashfords were taking entire families, whole wagon trains of settlers who had the misfortune to seek shelter at Ashford Manor during their travels west.
"You won't be alone," Cornelius said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I have been bound to this place for over 100 years, watching helplessly as innocent people suffered for crimes they didn't commit. If my continued existence can help prevent that suffering from spreading to other locations." He looked at Margaret, who nodded with understanding that transcended the need for words. "We have been given an unprecedented opportunity," she said. "Death without the finality of death. Existence without the limitations of life. We can go places the living cannot. Investigate sites that would be too dangerous for normal researchers. Gather evidence that has been hidden for generations." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of recognition rather than grief. She had thought she was coming to Blackwood Manor to restore a single building, to solve a single mystery. Instead, she had found her life's true purpose, not just fixing broken things, but healing wounds that had been inflicted on the very soul of the country itself. "Where do we start?" she asked. Margaret returned to the maps,
pointing to a location in Colorado marked with particularly dark symbols. Here, the Whitmore Silver Mine, established in 1883, the entity used the mining operation as a cover for harvesting workers and their families. According to my records, over 200 people disappeared into those tunnels, their bodies never recovered. And here, Cornelius added, indicating a site in Oregon, the Clearwater Logging Company. Entire crews of lumberjacks vanished during the winter of 1901, their disappearances blamed on harsh weather and dangerous working conditions. Sarah studied the maps, beginning to see patterns in the entity's feeding schedule, connections between sites that had been hidden for over a century. It was the kind of investigation that would require years of careful research, methodical documentation, and the willingness to face horrors that most people couldn't imagine. It was exactly the kind of work she had been born to do. "We'll need to be careful," she said, already making mental lists of equipment and resources. "If there are still secondary sites active, there might be other entities, other families bound by compulsions they don't understand. We'll need to approach each location with the same methodical precision we used here. And we'll need to document everything," Margaret added. "The real history of what happened in these places, the names and stories of the people who died there. They deserve to be remembered as more than just entries in a demon's ledger." Outside the hidden library, Sarah could hear sounds she hadn't noticed before. Birds singing in the overgrown garden, wind moving through the trees that surrounded the manor, the distant sound of her rental car's engine cooling in the afternoon sun. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the kind of everyday noise that spoke of a world finally free from the ancient hunger that had plagued it for so long. But she could also hear something else, the faint echo of voices calling from distant places, other sites where the entity's influence still lingered, other families trapped by compulsions they didn't understand. The work was far from over. Sarah Chen had come to Blackwood Manor looking for a house to restore. Instead, she had found her calling that would define the rest of her life, and possibly beyond. She had found her true family, and together they would make sure that no one else would ever have to face the darkness alone. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the restored entrance hall of Blackwood Manor, watching the morning sunlight stream through windows that had been cleaned to sparkling clarity. The marble staircase gleamed with fresh polish, its brass banister buffed to a warm golden glow that caught the light and threw it back in patterns that danced across walls, now painted in rich burgundy and cream. The portraits that had once watched visitors with cold, judgmental eyes had been replaced with photographs, faces of the people who had died in this place, finally given the dignity of being remembered as more than just names in a ledger. The transformation had been remarkable, but it was only the most visible part of the work that had consumed Sarah's life since that October day when she lit the fuse that ended a century of supernatural horror. The real restoration hadn't been architectural. It had been spiritual, emotional, a careful process of healing wounds that had been festering in the American landscape for generations. "The Whitmore mine investigation went better than expected," Cornelius said, emerging from the library that once was the manor's parlor. He carried a thick folder of documentation, his Victorian clothing now complemented by a modern tablet computer that looked incongruous in his 19th century hands, but which he had mastered with surprising efficiency. "The local authorities were initially skeptical, but when we showed them the location of the mass grave..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah had been there when they'd excavated the site, using ground-penetrating radar and archaeological techniques to locate the remains of over 200 miners and their families who had been fed to the entity's hunger during the 1880s. The discovery had made national news, finally giving those forgotten souls the acknowledgement they deserved, while providing closure to descendants who had wondered for generations what had happened to their ancestors. "Any signs of residual activity?" Sarah asked, although she suspected she already knew the answer.
None whatsoever. The site is completely clean, spiritually speaking. We've arranged for proper burial of the remains in the new memorial cemetery, and the local historical society is planning a dedication ceremony for next month. Margaret looked up from the maps she'd been updating on the main work table, her expression showing the kind of satisfaction that came from work well done. That makes 7 sites fully cleansed and documented. 17 more to go, according to the records we've uncovered. The work had been methodical, exhausting, and occasionally dangerous. Each site required careful investigation, both historical and supernatural, to determine the extent of the entity's influence and the number of souls that had been trapped there. Some locations had required nothing more than proper documentation and memorial services to allow the dead to rest. Others had needed more active intervention, cleansing rituals, excavation of hidden chambers, the destruction of ritual artifacts that still carried echoes of the entity's power. Sarah had discovered that her survival of the manor's destruction had left her changed in fundamental ways. She could see things that normal people couldn't, sense the presence of supernatural influences, communicate with spirits who had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. It wasn't exactly what she would have chosen for herself, but it made her uniquely qualified for the work that needed to be done. The Oregon logging site is proving more challenging, she said, reviewing the latest reports from their investigation team. The local Native American tribes have been helpful. They have oral histories about the area that go back generations, but there are still active spiritual disturbances in the deeper parts of the forest. We'll need to approach that one more carefully, Margaret agreed. Some of the sites were built on places that were already sacred, already connected to spiritual forces that predated the entity by millennia. We need to make sure our cleansing work doesn't disturb those older, more benevolent presences. The phone on Sarah's desk rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was the special line she'd set up for what she privately called the work, the number that appeared on business cards she'd left at historical societies, genealogy offices, and paranormal investigation websites. The calls came in regularly now, from people who had heard about her success with historical supernatural mysteries, who had their own family legends or local hauntings that needed investigation. Blackwood Historical Investigations, this is Sarah Chen. Miss Chen, thank God I got through to you. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and I'm calling about my family's ranch in Montana. We've been having incidents, things that might be connected to some old mining operations on our land. Sarah reached for a notepad, already falling into the familiar rhythm of taking initial case information. Can you tell me more about these incidents, Mrs. Whitman? People see lights in the old mine shafts at night, hear voices calling for help. My grandson was exploring up there last week and found what looked like old bones in one of the collapsed tunnels. And there's something in our family history. Stories about my great-grandfather, and some kind of business arrangement he made back in the 1890s. Something he always said we were never supposed to talk about. Sarah felt the familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling that had drawn her to Blackwood Manor in the first place. But now she understood what it meant, could recognize it for what it truly was. Not compulsion, but calling. The universe's way of guiding her toward work that needed to be done. Mrs. Whitman, I'd like to help you. Can you give me the specific location of your ranch? I'll need to do some historical research before I can visit, but I think we might be able to get to the bottom of what's happening there. She spent the next 20 minutes taking detailed notes, asking questions about family history and local legends, building the foundation for what would become their next investigation. When she finally hung up, she found Cornelius and Margaret watching her with expressions of pride and understanding. Montana. Another mining operation, another family with stories they've been afraid to tell. The pattern continues, Cornelius observed. Even with the primary entity destroyed, the echoes of its influence are still reverberating through the landscape. Every site we cleanse seems to lead to the discovery of 2 more that need attention. Sarah nodded, but she wasn't discouraged by the magnitude of the task ahead. If anything, she felt energized by it. This was her life's work now. Her true calling. She had found something that gave meaning to all the pain and loss she had experienced, a way to transform her own suffering into healing for others. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling out a leather portfolio that Sarah hadn't seen before. She opened it to reveal what looked like architectural plans, detailed drawings of a building that managed to be both modern and classical, functional and beautiful. Sarah recognized the style immediately. It was the kind of design that would have been used for universities or museums, buildings meant to house knowledge and preserve it for future generations.
A research center, Margaret explained, specifically designed for the kind of work we're doing. Archives for storing the historical documentation we're gathering, laboratories for analyzing artifacts and evidence, living spaces for investigators who might need to stay on site during long-term projects. Sarah studied the plans with growing excitement. The building would be perfect for their needs, large enough to house the growing collection of documents and evidence they were accumulating, but designed with enough flexibility to adapt as their understanding of supernatural phenomena continued to evolve. "Where would we build it?" she asked. Margaret smiled and gestured toward the windows that looked out on the manor's extensive grounds. "Right here, on the site where the original Ashford feeding operations were centered. It seems fitting, don't you think? Transform a place of horror into a center for healing and justice." Cornelius was examining the plans with the eye of someone who had lived through the golden age of American architecture. "The design is excellent, classical proportions with modern functionality, but the cost won't be a problem," Sarah said, surprising herself with her confidence. "I've been contacted by the Whitmore family descendants about setting up a foundation in honor of the miners who died at their site, and the State Historical Preservation Society is interested in providing funding for a research center focused on documenting previously unknown historical sites." It was true. The success of their first several investigations had attracted attention from academic institutions, government agencies, and private donors who were fascinated by the intersection of historical research and supernatural investigation. Sarah had been careful to present their work in academic terms, focusing on the archaeological and genealogical aspects rather than the more esoteric elements, but the results spoke for themselves. "There's also this," Sarah continued, pulling out a letter she'd received the week before. "The FBI's Historical Cold Case Unit wants to consult with us on several missing person cases from the late 1800s. Apparently, our work at the Whitmore site has provided new leads in cases they'd given up on decades ago." She had never imagined that her life would take such an unexpected turn. 6 months ago, she'd been a recently divorced museum worker looking for a cheap house to restore. Now she was running a successful paranormal investigation business, working with law enforcement agencies, and planning to build a research center that would revolutionize the study of historical supernatural phenomena. "There's one more thing," she said, pulling out the most recent letter she'd received. The envelope was expensive stationery, the kind used by law firms and government offices. Inside was a formal offer from the Smithsonian Institution inviting Sarah to serve as a consulting researcher on a new project studying unexplained disappearances in American frontier history. "They want me to head up a team of investigators working on what they're calling the Lost Americans Project, documenting and investigating the thousands of people who vanished during westward expansion, focusing on cases where the historical record doesn't match local folklore and family stories." Cornelius and Margaret exchanged a look of profound satisfaction. This was exactly what they had hoped for when they had first revealed the scope of the entity's feeding operations. Not just the resolution of individual cases, but the creation of a systematic approach to uncovering and healing historical wounds that had been hidden for generations. "You'll accept, of course," Margaret said. It wasn't really a question. "We'll accept," Sarah corrected. "I'm not doing this work alone anymore. I need partners who understand both the historical and supernatural aspects of what we're investigating." She looked around the restored entrance hall, at the photographs of people who had finally been given the dignity of being remembered, at the maps and documents that told stories of courage and tragedy and redemption. This place that had once been a monument to hunger and horror had been transformed into something beautiful and healing. But more than that, it had become a home. "I had a conversation with Jenny last week about the family legacy, about the compulsion that's driven our bloodline for generations. She thinks it's finally broken.
that with the primary entity destroyed and its secondary sites being systematically cleansed, the supernatural pull on our family line has been severed permanently. "And what do you think?" Cornelius asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. She thought about the phone call from Mrs. Whitman, about the dozens of other cases that had found their way to her desk, and about the strange dreams she'd been having lately. Dreams of other places, other families, other supernatural wounds that needed healing. "I think she's right about the compulsion," she said finally. "I don't feel driven anymore, not the way I did when I first came here. But I think there's something else now, something better."
She moved to the window and looked out at the grounds where Margaret's research center would soon stand, at the gardens that were slowly coming back to life after decades of neglect, at the forest beyond where normal wildlife had returned for the first time in over a century. "I think what I feel now is purpose, real purpose, not supernatural compulsion. The work we're doing, giving names and dignity to people who were forgotten, helping families understand their histories, healing wounds that have been festering for generations. This is what I was meant to do with my life." "And if the work leads us to other entities?" Margaret asked. "Other supernatural threats that need to be dealt with?" Sarah smiled, feeling more confident than she had in years. "Then we deal with them, together, with proper preparation, solid research, and the knowledge that we're not doing this for glory or profit, but because it's the right thing to do." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the restored windows, painting the entrance hall in warm gold and amber that made the marble staircase look like something from a fairy tale. In 6 hours, Sarah had a conference call with the Smithsonian team to discuss the parameters of their research project. Tomorrow, she and Cornelius would drive to Montana to begin the preliminary investigation of the Whitman Ranch. Next week, Margaret would present the research center plans to the county zoning board. But for now, in this moment, Sarah allowed herself to simply stand in the quiet beauty of what they had accomplished and feel proud of the work they had done. She thought about the first time she had stood in this hall, surrounded by shadows and decay, feeling the weight of centuries of horror pressing down on her shoulders. She remembered her terror in the basement chamber, her desperation as she'd lit the fuse that destroyed the entity, her certainty that she was about to die. She had been wrong about that last part, but in a way, the woman who had entered Blackwood Manor 6 months ago had died. Sarah Chen, the museum worker, the divorcee, the woman who collected broken things out of compulsion, that person was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had found her true family and her real calling, someone who could look supernatural horror in the face and choose to fight rather than flee. The phone rang again, and Sarah answered it with confidence, ready to help whoever was calling, ready to take on whatever challenge awaited them next. Because Sarah Chen was no longer someone who simply restored broken things. She was someone who healed wounded souls. And she was just getting started. 5 years later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the podium in the main lecture hall of the Margaret Ashford Research Center for Historical Supernatural Studies, looking out at an audience that would have been impossible to imagine when she'd first bought Blackwood Manor. The hall was packed with historians, archaeologists, FBI agents, paranormal investigators, and family members of people who had vanished during America's westward expansion. At the back of the room, she could see Cornelius and Margaret, both now serving as senior researchers at the center, their unique perspectives on historical events proving invaluable to the academic community. Ladies and gentlemen, after 5 years of systematic investigation, I'm pleased to announce that we have successfully identified and documented 43 separate sites across the American West where supernatural entities conducted organized harvesting of human souls between 1847 and 1912. She clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the United States dotted with red markers that told the story of horror hidden in plain sight for over a century. Of these 43 sites, 37 have been fully cleansed and memorialized,
with appropriate ceremonies conducted for the estimated 3,000 souls who had been trapped at these locations. The applause was warm but subdued. Everyone in the room understood that they were celebrating justice long delayed, rather than a simple academic achievement. Sarah had learned over the years that this work required a delicate balance between scholarly objectivity and deep emotional sensitivity. Every site they investigated represented not just historical data points, but real families, real people who had suffered unimaginable terror before finding peace at last. The remaining 6 sites present unique challenges that we are continuing to address with the help of local Native American tribes whose ancestral knowledge has proven essential to our understanding of the pre-Columbian spiritual forces that some entities attempted to co-opt. She clicked to another slide showing photographs from their most recent investigation, a former trading post in Arizona where the entity had tried to corrupt an ancient sacred site. I'm happy to report that the Navajo Nation spiritual leaders have agreed to work with us on developing protocols for these more sensitive locations. After the presentation, Sarah mingled with the audience during the reception, answering questions and listening to new leads that might require investigation. It never ceased to amaze her how many families carried stories they had been afraid to tell. Legends passed down through generations about relatives who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, or places that had been avoided without anyone remembering exactly why. She moved to the window and looked out at the grounds where Margaret's research center would soon stand, at the gardens that were slowly coming back to life after decades of neglect, at the forest beyond where normal wildlife had returned for the first time in over a century. I think what I feel now is purpose, real purpose, not supernatural compulsion. The work we're doing, giving names and dignity to people who were forgotten, helping families understand their histories, healing wounds that have been festering for generations. This is what I was meant to do with my life. And if the work leads us to other entities? Margaret asked. Other supernatural threats that need to be dealt with? Sarah smiled, feeling more confident than she had in years. Then we deal with them, together, with proper preparation, solid research, and the knowledge that we're not doing this for glory or profit, but because it's the right thing to do. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the restored windows, painting the entrance hall in warm gold and amber that made the marble staircase look like something from a fairy tale. In 6 hours, Sarah had a conference call with the Smithsonian team to discuss the parameters of their research project. Tomorrow, she and Cornelius would drive to Montana to begin the preliminary investigation of the Whitman Ranch. Next week, Margaret would present the research center plans to the county zoning board. But for now, in this moment, Sarah allowed herself to simply stand in the quiet beauty of what they had accomplished and feel proud of the work they had done. She thought about the first time she had stood in this hall, surrounded by shadows and decay, feeling the weight of centuries of horror pressing down on her shoulders. She remembered her terror in the basement chamber, her desperation as she'd lit the fuse that destroyed the entity, her certainty that she was about to die. She had been wrong about that last part, but in a way, the woman who had entered Blackwood Manor 6 months ago had died. Sarah Chen, the museum worker, the divorcee, the woman who collected broken things out of compulsion, that person was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had found her true family and her real calling, someone who could look supernatural horror in the face and choose to fight rather than flee. The phone rang again, and Sarah answered it with confidence, ready to help whoever was calling, ready to take on whatever challenge awaited them next. Because Sarah Chen was no longer someone who simply restored broken things. She was someone who healed wounded souls. And she was just getting started. 5 years later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the podium in the main lecture hall of the Margaret Ashford Research Center for Historical Supernatural Studies, looking out at an audience that would have been impossible to imagine when she'd first bought Blackwood Manor. The hall was packed with historians, archaeologists, FBI agents, paranormal investigators,
and family members of people who had vanished during America's westward expansion. At the back of the room, she could see Cornelius and Margaret, both now serving as senior researchers at the center, their unique perspectives on historical events proving invaluable to the academic community. Ladies and gentlemen, after 5 years of systematic investigation, I'm pleased to announce that we have successfully identified and documented 43 separate sites across the American West where supernatural entities conducted organized harvesting of human souls between 1847 and 1912. She clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the United States dotted with red markers that told the story of horror hidden in plain sight for over a century. Of these 43 sites, 37 have been fully cleansed and memorialized, with appropriate ceremonies conducted for the estimated 3,000 souls who had been trapped at these locations. The applause was warm but subdued. Everyone in the room understood that they were celebrating justice long delayed, rather than a simple academic achievement. Sarah had learned over the years that this work required a delicate balance between scholarly objectivity and deep emotional sensitivity. Every site they investigated represented not just historical data points, but real families, real people who had suffered unimaginable terror before finding peace at last. The remaining 6 sites present unique challenges that we are continuing to address with the help of local Native American tribes whose ancestral knowledge has proven essential to our understanding of the pre-Columbian spiritual forces that some entities attempted to co-opt. She clicked to another slide showing photographs from their most recent investigation, a former trading post in Arizona where the entity had tried to corrupt an ancient sacred site. I'm happy to report that the Navajo Nation spiritual leaders have agreed to work with us on developing protocols for these more sensitive locations. After the presentation, Sarah mingled with the audience during the reception, answering questions and listening to new leads that might require investigation. It never ceased to amaze her how many families carried stories they had been afraid to tell. Legends passed down through generations about relatives who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, or places that had been avoided without anyone remembering exactly why.
Dr. Chen? A young man approached her, clutching a manila folder with the desperate grip of someone who had been carrying a burden for too long. My name is David Thornfield. I'm a graduate student at Berkeley, but I'm here because of my family history. My great-great-grandfather owned a shipping company in San Francisco during the 1890s, and there are stories. Sarah had heard countless variations of this conversation over the years, but she never became casual about them. Each family's pain was unique. Each mystery deserved her full attention. What kind of stories, Mr. Thornfield? Ships that would disappear for weeks at a time, then return with smaller crews and no explanation for where the missing sailors had gone. Cargo manifests that didn't match what was actually unloaded. And there's this. He opened the folder and pulled out a daguerreotype that made Sarah's breath catch. The photograph showed a man in Victorian dress standing on a ship's deck, but it was the background that captured her attention. Behind the figure, barely visible in the shadows of the ship's hold, were symbols carved into the wooden walls, the same primitive markings she had learned to recognize as signs of the entity's influence. We believe your great-great-grandfather may have been operating under supernatural compulsion, Sarah said gently. Would you be willing to let us investigate this? It might help us understand what happened to those missing sailors. David nodded eagerly, relief evident on his face. I've been researching this for 3 years, but I didn't know who else would take it seriously. When I heard about your work, Sarah handed him her business card and scheduled a preliminary interview for the following week. As she watched him leave, obviously lighter for having shared his family's burden with someone who understood, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Another case? Margaret appeared at her elbow, her expression showing the kind of pleased anticipation that Sarah had learned to associate with particularly interesting mysteries. Maritime operations this time.
If the pattern holds, there are probably dozens of sailors who were reported as lost at sea but were actually fed to the entity during trans-Pacific voyages. The reach of these operations was truly staggering, Cornelius observed, joining their conversation. We've identified feeding sites from California to Maine, from the Canadian border to the Mexican territories. It's as if the entire westward expansion was orchestrated to provide cover for supernatural harvesting. Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to another conversation happening near the refreshment table. A woman in her 60s was speaking quietly with one of the FBI agents, showing him what looked like a collection of old letters. Something about the woman's posture, the careful way she held the documents, triggered Sarah's investigative instincts. "Excuse me," she said to Margaret and Cornelius, making her way across the room. "Mrs.?" She approached the woman with the gentle directness she had perfected over years of working with traumatized families. "Blackstone. Helen Blackstone." She looked up with eyes that held the particular kind of exhaustion that came from carrying secrets for too long. "I wasn't sure I should come today, but after hearing your presentation..." She held out one of the letters, written in faded ink on paper that looked at least a century old. Sarah read it carefully, her pulse quickening as she recognized the familiar patterns of supernatural compulsion disguised as business correspondence. "My family operated a series of boarding houses along the Oregon Trail in the 1880s. They were supposed to be safe stops for travelers, places where wagon trains could rest and resupply before continuing west. But according to these letters, my ancestors were selecting certain guests. Families who had no one waiting for them at their destination, people who wouldn't be missed if they simply vanished between one stop and the next." Sarah exchanged a look with the FBI agent, who was already taking notes. "Mrs. Blackstone, have you experienced any unusual phenomena at the sites of these former boarding houses? Dreams, visions, unexplained sounds or sightings?" Her composure cracked slightly. "My grandson bought property in Oregon last year, land that includes the ruins of one of the old boarding houses. He's been seeing things, hearing voices calling for help in the middle of the night. His wife is threatening to leave if he doesn't sell the property, but he says he can't. Says something won't let him." Another case. Another family trapped by the echoes of their ancestors' supernatural crimes. Sarah felt the familiar stirring in her chest, but now she recognized it for what it had always been. Not compulsion, but calling. The universe's way of guiding her toward work that desperately needed to be done. "We can help," she said simply. "This is exactly the kind of situation we've developed protocols for handling."
The relief on Helen's face was immediate and profound. "I was so afraid you'd think I was crazy, that no one would believe. Mrs. Blackstone, over the past 5 years, we've learned that the truly crazy thing would be to dismiss these stories without investigation. Your family's history fits a pattern we've seen dozens of times before, and we have very effective methods for resolving these situations." As Sarah scheduled another preliminary interview, she reflected on how much had changed since that first terrifying night in Blackwood Manor's basement. The research center now employed 12 full-time investigators, maintained partnerships with 6 universities, and had resolved cases that had puzzled law enforcement agencies for over a century. But more importantly, they had given peace to thousands of souls who had been trapped by supernatural evil and healing to hundreds of families who had finally learned the truth about their ancestral mysteries. The reception wound down as the sun set behind the mountains that surrounded the research center. Sarah walked through the building that had been constructed on the exact site where the entity's primary feeding chamber had once gaped like a wound in the earth. Now the space housed one of the world's most comprehensive archives of supernatural historical research, its clean lines and abundant natural light serving as a testament to the power of transformation and healing. She paused in her office, looking at the photographs that lined the walls. Not the grim documentation of crime scenes, but celebration photos from memorial ceremonies and dedication services. Families reunited with the truth about their loved ones. Communities finally understand the dark chapters of their local history. Former feeding sites transformed into places of remembrance and peace. "Knock, knock,"
Jenny's voice came from the doorway, and Sarah turned to see her sister carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "What are we celebrating?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The Portland Tribune wants to do a feature story on the research center for their Halloween issue. Local woman transforms family curse into force for justice. They want to interview both of us about growing up with the family legends and how it feels to have them finally resolved." Sarah accepted the champagne with mixed feelings. Media attention was helpful for their work. It brought in funding, attracted new cases, and helped normalize the idea that supernatural phenomena could be investigated using scientific methods. But more importantly, they had given peace to thousands of souls who had been trapped by supernatural evil and healing to hundreds of families who had finally learned the truth about their ancestral mysteries. "There's something else," Jenny continued, her expression becoming more serious. "Mom called this morning. She's been having dreams again." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air coming through her office windows. "What kind of dreams?" "The old kind. Voices calling from underground places, shadows moving in empty rooms, the sense that something is watching the family and waiting for the right moment to strike." Jenny sat down heavily in the chair across from Sarah's desk. "But here's the thing. She's not afraid anymore. The dreams don't feel like warnings or compulsions. They feel like requests for help." Sarah poured champagne for both of them, her mind already working through the implications. "New cases? New entities? Other families trapped by supernatural compulsions they don't understand? That's what Mom thinks. She says it feels like the success of our work here has somehow made us visible to other supernatural situations that need resolution, like we've become a beacon for families who are dealing with generational mysteries." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lights come on across the research center campus. The building hummed with quiet activity, investigators working late on case files, archivists cataloging new evidence, graduate students researching historical records that might provide clues to unsolved disappearances. The work never stopped, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a calling that Sarah had finally learned to embrace completely. "Are you ready for that, Sarah? For the work to expand beyond the entity's direct influence? For dealing with whatever other supernatural threats might be out there?" Sarah considered the question seriously. 5 years ago, she was a broken woman buying a haunted house on impulse, driven by compulsions she didn't understand toward mysteries she wasn't equipped to solve. Now she was an expert in her field, surrounded by capable partners, backed by institutional support and governmental funding. More importantly, she had found her true purpose, discovered work that gave meaning to all the pain and loss she had experienced. "I think about that night in the basement sometimes. The moment when I had to choose between running for my life and staying to fight something I barely understood. I was terrified, but I made the choice anyway because it was the right thing to do." She gestured toward the files on her desk. New cases, new families, new opportunities to transform horror into healing. "Every case we take on now is essentially the same choice, just with better preparation and more support. And every time, the answer is the same. If we can help, we have an obligation to try." Jenny raised her glass in a toast. "To Sarah Chen, who bought a haunted house and accidentally became one of the most effective paranormal investigators in the country."
"To the Chen family," Sarah corrected, "who finally learned that some curses are actually disguised callings." As they drank, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Chen, my name is Robert Ashford, and I believe I'm related to your research partner, Margaret. I have a family estate in England that has been abandoned for over 150 years. There are stories. I think you might be interested in investigating." Sarah showed the message to Jenny, who laughed with the kind of delight that suggested she had been expecting exactly this development. "England? Really? Apparently our work is going international." Sarah was already mentally making lists of what they would need for an overseas investigation. Margaret is going to be thrilled. She's been wanting to research the original Ashford family seat for years. And Cornelius will probably insist on coming along to provide proper Victorian context for a proper Victorian mystery.
Sarah smiled, imagining her ghostly research partner's reaction to the news that their work was expanding beyond American borders. This is exactly the kind of challenge he's been hoping for. The evening was settling into full darkness outside, but the research center continued to glow with warm light from within. Somewhere in the archive levels, Margaret was probably still working on her comprehensive index of entity feeding patterns across North America. In the residential wing, visiting investigators were preparing for tomorrow's fieldwork on active cases. In laboratories scattered throughout the building, forensic specialists were analyzing evidence that would finally give names and dignity to people who had been missing for over a century. Sarah looked at her reflection in the office window, seeing not the broken woman who had arrived at Blackwood Manor 5 years ago, but someone who had found her true calling and learned to embrace it completely. The work was difficult, sometimes dangerous, always emotionally demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that ordinary career success could never match. She had started as someone who collected broken things out of compulsion. She had become someone who healed wounded souls by choice. And as her phone buzzed with another message, this one from a family in Scotland who had heard about her work through academic channels, Sarah realized that her story was just beginning. The curse that had haunted her family for generations had been broken, transformed into something beautiful and purposeful. The horror that had defined Blackwood Manor for over a century had been replaced with hope and healing. The entity that had fed on fear and despair had been destroyed by love and determination. But the work of healing the wounds left by supernatural evil would continue for generations to come, and Sarah Chen, along with her chosen family of the living and the dead, would be there to guide that healing for as long as the universe needed their help. In the distance, she could hear the sound of new arrivals at the research center, another family come to share their story, another mystery ready to be solved, another opportunity to transform darkness into light. Sarah Chen smiled, finished her champagne, and got back to work. Because some callings never end, they just grow stronger. What an incredible journey! If this 15-minute supernatural thriller kept you on the edge of your seat, show some love with a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Your support takes just seconds but means everything to us. Hit subscribe for more spine-tingling investigations. Sarah Chen's story continues, and you won't want to miss what happens next. 3 months later, the Ashford Estate, Yorkshire, England. The morning fog clung to the Yorkshire moors like the breath of sleeping giants, obscuring the ancient stone walls of Ashford Hall until only the highest towers were visible above the grey shroud. The estate had been abandoned since 1851, according to Robert Ashford's correspondence, but standing here in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah could sense that abandoned didn't mean empty. The local villagers crossed themselves when they mentioned this place, Cornelius observed, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, despite his supernatural nature, a phenomenon Sarah had never quite understood but had learned to accept. The taxi driver wouldn't come within a mile of the gates, said the road was cursed proper, and no amount of money was worth risking his soul. Margaret stood beside them, studying architectural drawings she'd obtained from the British Historical Society. Even in the dim light, her excitement was palpable. "This is where it all began," she said softly, "the original seat of the Ashford family's power, the place where they first made contact with entities from the deep places. If we can understand what happened here, we might finally be able to trace the full extent of their supernatural operations." Sarah checked her equipment one final time, the same methodical preparation that had served her well through dozens of investigations over the past 5 years. Digital cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and most importantly, the portable ritual containment kit they'd developed after encountering several sites where supernatural energies had proven more active than expected.
Digital cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and most importantly, the portable ritual containment kit they developed after encountering several sites where supernatural energies had proven more active than expected. Robert Ashford's letters mentioned family records that were left behind when the estate was evacuated, Sarah said, reviewing her notes. If those documents survived, they might contain information about other entities, other feeding operations we haven't discovered yet. She pushed open the gates, which swung inward with the sound like the groaning of something in pain. The drive beyond was overgrown with thorny bushes that seemed to reach toward them with deliberate intent, forcing the team to walk single file along what had once been a grand approach to one of England's most impressive country houses. Ashford Hall loomed out of the fog like something from a Gothic nightmare, all pointed towers and flying buttresses, gargoyles perched at every corner with expressions of perpetual malice. But it was the windows that captured Sarah's attention, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as though the architect had been following geometries that belonged to some other dimension entirely. The same impossible architecture we found at Blackwood Manor, Cornelius noted grimly, but more sophisticated, more deliberately integrated into the building's design. This place wasn't converted for supernatural purposes, it was built specifically to house them. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. Sarah felt the familiar stirring in her chest, but now she recognized it immediately, not supernatural compulsion, but the excitement of a professional investigator encountering a particularly complex mystery. The fear was still there. She wasn't foolish enough to enter a place like this without healthy respect for its dangers, but it was balanced by 5 years of experience and the confidence that came from successful resolution of 43 similar cases. "Remember the protocols," she said as they crossed the threshold into the entrance hall. "Document everything. Maintain constant communication, and if anyone experiences supernatural influence, we retreat immediately and regroup." The interior of Ashford Hall was a testament to Victorian excess taken to supernatural extremes. The entrance hall soared 3 stories overhead, its vaulted ceiling decorated with frescoes that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Sarah photographed them methodically, noting how the painted figures appeared to be reaching toward a central point where the ceiling's geometry became too complex to follow with normal human vision. "The family portraits," Margaret said, her voice tight with recognition. She was staring at the walls, which were lined with paintings of Ashford ancestors dating back centuries. But unlike normal family portraits, these seemed to track the viewer's movements, their eyes following the investigators as they moved through the hall. Sarah examined the paintings more closely and felt her skin crawl. The subjects weren't just painted, they were trapped, their faces showing expressions of absolute terror frozen for eternity behind layers of oil and varnish. At the bottom of each frame was a brass nameplate, but instead of normal death dates, each one read, "Fed to the deep, year." They were feeding their own family members to the entities, their own children, their elderly relatives, anyone who became inconvenient or asked too many questions. "It gets worse," Margaret said, pointing to the most recent portrait. The brass plate read, "Margaret Elizabeth Ashford, fed to the deep, 1851. But the face in the painting was unmistakably Margaret herself, captured in oils with photographic accuracy. "They painted my portrait before I escaped. They had already decided I was going to be sacrificed." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's temperature. "Which means they knew you were going to try to flee. They were planning to use your death as some kind of final ritual." Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Not the random creaking of an old building, but purposeful movement, as though someone was walking through the corridors with deliberate intent. The investigators froze, listening as the footsteps approached the entrance hall. "Sarah Chen,"
The voice that spoke was cultured, male, with precise diction of upper-class Victorian England. "Lord Ashford, I presume," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The family patriarch who orchestrated the feeding operations across 2 continents."
"Guilty as charged, my dear." Lord Ashford began descending the staircase with leisurely confidence, "though I prefer to think of it as spiritual entrepreneurship. We provided a valuable service, you see, connecting ancient entities with the sustenance they required while building wealth and power that allowed our family to thrive for generations." More figures began appearing in the shadows around the entrance hall, dozens of them, all wearing the clothing of different historical periods, but sharing the same predatory expressions and filed teeth. Sarah realized with growing horror that these were the Ashford family members who had willingly participated in the feeding operations, who had chosen to serve the entities rather than become their victims. "Until you interfered," Lord Ashford continued, his tone conversational despite the menace underlying every word. "Your destruction of our American operations was inconvenient. It severed our connection to a very lucrative revenue stream, but it also freed us from certain supernatural constraints that had limited our activities. We are no longer bound to serve a single entity, you see. We can now make arrangements with any number of supernatural forces, expanding our operations in ways we never imagined possible." Sarah's hand moved slowly toward the emergency flare in her equipment belt, their agreed-upon signal for immediate retreat. But before she could reach it, Margaret stepped forward with an expression of absolute fury. "You're lying," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent over a century studying the entity's operations. "The destruction of the primary feeding chamber didn't free you, it trapped you. Your ghosts tied to this place by your own crimes, unable to move on because you chose to serve evil rather than accept redemption." Lord Ashford's smile faltered slightly. "My dear Margaret, always so dramatic. Yes, we are temporarily inconvenienced by our current state, but that situation is about to change. You see, we have been in communication with other entities, other forces that are quite interested in establishing new feeding operations. All we need is a suitable sacrifice to bind the new arrangements." He gestured toward Sarah with theatrical flourish. "Someone of proven spiritual strength, someone who has successfully opposed supernatural evil, someone whose death would carry the kind of symbolic weight necessary to cement our new partnerships." "And if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though she was already calculating distances to the exit and mentally reviewing the containment procedures they'd developed for hostile supernatural encounters. "Oh, my dear woman, you misunderstand completely." Lord Ashford's smile returned, wider and more predatory than before. "This isn't a negotiation. This is a trap that we have been preparing for 5 years, ever since word of your success at Blackwood Manor reached the supernatural community." The entrance hall doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and Sarah felt the familiar sensation of space folding in on itself, the same impossible geometry she'd encountered in the manor's basement chamber. But this was more sophisticated, more deliberately crafted. The Ashford family had spent decades perfecting their supernatural architecture. Every investigation you've conducted, every site you've cleansed, every soul you've freed, all of it has been building your reputation in supernatural circles. You have become something of a legend, Sarah Chen, the woman who destroyed the hunger of the deep places, the investigator who cannot be corrupted or frightened away from her work.
Sarah felt Cornelius and Margaret move closer to her, forming a defensive triangle as the ghostly Ashfords began to circle them like predators surrounding wounded prey. But she also felt something else, a growing sense of confidence that surprised her. This was exactly the kind of situation she had been training for, had developed protocols to handle. "The thing is," she said, pulling out her portable containment device, "I've learned quite a bit about dealing with hostile supernatural entities over the past 5 years. And one thing I've discovered is that ghosts who chose to serve evil are usually much weaker than they pretend to be." She activated the device, which began emitting a high-pitched tone that made the ghostly Ashfords flinch and cover their ears. The sound was specifically calibrated to disrupt supernatural manifestations, based on research conducted at dozens of cleansed sites. "Clever little gadget," Lord Ashford admitted, though his form was already beginning to flicker. "But you're still trapped in our domain, still subject to our rules, and we have had decades to prepare for this encounter." The walls around them began to bleed, not blood, but something darker and more viscous, a substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Sarah recognized it immediately from her research into the entity's feeding operations. Ectoplasmic residue, the spiritual equivalent of toxic waste left behind by supernatural predation. "The house is saturated with the energy of everyone who died here," Margaret realized with growing horror. "Hundreds of victims over the centuries, all of them used to power the family's supernatural operations. That's why the architecture is so wrong, why the geometry hurts to look at directly. This entire building is essentially a massive supernatural battery."
Precisely. Lord Ashford clapped his hands in delight, his form solidifying again as the building's stored energy flowed through him. "And now that battery will power our return to the physical world, allowing us to establish new feeding operations anywhere we choose. All we need is the right catalyst." He gestured towards Sarah again, and this time she felt an actual supernatural force behind the motion, a pressure that tried to drive her to her knees, to make her submit to the will of the ghostly aristocrat. But Sarah had felt this kind of compulsion before, and had learned to recognize it and resist it. "The problem with your plan," she said, standing straighter despite the supernatural pressure, "is that you're still thinking like 19th century aristocrats. You assume that because you have power and I'm just one person, you automatically win." She reached into her equipment bag and pulled out a device that none of the Ashford ghosts had ever seen before, a modified electromagnetic pulse generator that she and her team had developed specifically for dealing with spiritually charged locations. "But I'm not just one person anymore. I have a team, I have resources, and most importantly, I have backup." Sarah triggered the EMP device, sending a pulse of electromagnetic energy through the house's supernatural architecture. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the bleeding walls began to crack, the impossible geometry started to collapse, and the ghostly Ashfords began to scream as the energy they'd been drawing from the house's victims was suddenly severed. "Impossible!" Lord Ashford raged, his form now flickering like a candle in a strong wind. "You cannot disrupt a century of accumulated spiritual energy with some modern gadget." "I can't," Sarah agreed, "but we can." The entrance hall doors burst open, revealing a sight that made the ghostly Ashfords recoil in absolute terror. Dozens of spirits, all glowing with warm golden light, all moving with purpose toward the trapped investigators. Sarah recognized some of them, souls she had helped free from other feeding sites, victims of the entity's hunger who had found peace through her work. But most of them were strangers, spirits she had never encountered before. Men, women, and children in clothing from across the centuries, all of them bearing the same expression of determined justice. They were the victims of the Ashford family's feeding operations, the souls who had been trapped in this place for generations, waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to give them the chance for revenge. "You thought you could trap me using the energy of your victims," Sarah said, as the golden spirits began surrounding the flickering Ashford ghosts. "But you've forgotten that I've spent 5 years freeing souls from supernatural imprisonment. They remember me, they trust me, and they've been waiting for someone to give them the chance to settle accounts." What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a reckoning that had been building for over a century. The victim spirits didn't attack the Ashford ghosts so much as simply reclaim them. The golden light that surrounded each freed soul began to pull at the darkness that had sustained the family spirits, draining away the malevolent energy they had accumulated through decades of supernatural predation. Lord Ashford and his descendants tried to resist, but they had made themselves vulnerable by drawing so deeply on the house's stored spiritual energy. The very power that had made them seem invincible also connected them directly to their victims, creating a conduit that the freed souls could use to exact justice. "This isn't possible," Lord Ashford gasped as his form began to dissolve. "We made deals with forces beyond human comprehension. We were promised eternal power in exchange for our service." "The thing about making deals with evil entities is that they never honor their contracts. They take what they want and leave their servants to face the consequences alone." One by one, the Ashford family spirits were pulled into the golden light, their screams of rage and terror fading as the accumulated spiritual energy of their crimes was finally balanced by the justice their victims had been denied for so long. The impossible architecture of the entrance hall collapsed back into normal three-dimensional space, and the bleeding walls returned to ordinary stone and plaster. When it was over, Sarah found herself standing in what looked like a perfectly normal Victorian mansion, albeit one that had been abandoned for over a century. Dust motes danced in shafts of morning sunlight, streaming through windows that no longer hurt to look at directly. The paintings on the walls were gone, leaving behind only empty frames and cleaner patches on the faded wallpaper. "Is it finished?" she asked, though she could already feel the difference, the oppressive spiritual weight that had pressed down on them since entering the estate was gone, replaced by the kind of peaceful silence that spoke of old wounds finally healed.
"For this place, yes," Margaret confirmed. "The Ashford family's power here has been broken permanently. The house can finally rest." But Cornelius was examining documents that had been left behind in the spiritual upheaval, papers that had materialized on a table that definitely hadn't been there moments before. "Sarah, you need to see this. It appears the Ashfords maintained correspondence with supernatural entities across Europe. There are feeding operations in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, possibly dozens of sites we haven't even begun to investigate." Sarah took the documents with hands that were surprisingly steady. 5 years ago, the prospect of investigating dozens of additional supernatural sites would have filled her with dread. Now, she felt only the familiar stirring of professional interest and the satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her true calling. "Then we have our work cut out for us," she said simply. "But we've proven that no matter how old or powerful these entities think they can be defeated. Justice may be delayed, but it's never denied permanently." As they prepared to leave Ashford Hall, Sarah took one last look at the mansion that had housed such evil for so many generations. In the afternoon sunlight, with its supernatural architecture returned to normal proportions, it looked almost beautiful, a testament to what could be accomplished when darkness was finally driven out by the light of truth and justice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny. "How did it go? Are you ready to come home? Or should I start planning European research trips?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Pack your passport. We're going to be busy for a while." Because some work was bigger than any one person could handle alone.
But with the right team, the right resources, and the right commitment to justice, even the most ancient evils could be defeated. What an incredible journey! If this 15-minute supernatural thriller kept you on the edge of your seat, show some love with a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Your support takes just seconds, but means everything to us. Hit subscribe for more spine-tingling investigations. Sarah Chen's story continues, and you won't want to miss what happens next.